And if you have any questions, there's a please, we'll have time at the end to do that. So our book is called Guelph and Wellington County's Legal Past, A History of the Wellington Law Association. This is a book that was done late last year, and we are, like I said, we're looking to do slowly a bit of a book launch. All members of the Wellington Law Association have received a copy. I'm going to start off. There's a bit of an overview. We're going to cover the start of the Wellington Law Association. Leanne's going to take us through some court buildings. I'm going to talk about some famous Guelph legal cases. We'll both tell you about some famous Guelph lawyers, and we'll give you a little bit of background on the people involved in the writing of this book. In the late 1870s, the Law Society of Upper Canada, as it then was, decided to make some funds available for lawyers in smaller centers outside of Toronto to be able to start a library. Guelph was one of the first jurisdictions to start a law association, which was called the Wellington County Law Association Law Library. So that was started. There was a group of 11 lawyers who founded the association. There were some very prominent people at the time, including Henry Peterson, who you will hear about, and Ebenezer Johnson, a leading litigation lawyer at the time, and Donald Guthrie, whose great grandson Hugh was a member for many years, and we actually have Ann Guthrie on our board, and she helped us. The numbers of lawyers in Guelph have really, and Wellington County, really evolved over the years. 1861, which is the earliest we have records for, there were 9 lawyers in Guelph, 1 in the county. 1882 went up to 18 lawyers in Guelph and 11 in the county. 1990, they're up to 40, 20 split. World War I seemed to have resulted in a bit of a reduction. It went down to, there were 16 lawyers in Guelph, 6 in the county, and World War II seems to have slowed the numbers. There were 21 lawyers in Guelph in 1950, 7 in the county. Starting in the 1970s, though, probably with the expansion of post-secondary education, the numbers rose to 72, 60 in Guelph, 12 in the county, and almost tripled 25 years later. In the year 2000, there were 151 lawyers in Guelph, 28 in the county. The last year for which we have records for our book was the year 2016. There are 181 lawyers in Guelph, 30 in the county. Women lawyers were slow to be developed. I'm pleased to notice that Her Honor Justice Caspers is in our audience tonight. She was one of the first in the county who one of the first in the early 1980s who became a member. Joan Heath was the first member in the 1950s and 1960s, and it took until 1980 before we had more than one female practicing lawyer, which is just shows how slow the legal profession evolved. In 2016, 71 of the 181 lawyers in the city of Guelph were women lawyers, and 22 of 30 in the county. So they were pretty close to half time. When you hear me say the word click, that's my signal to Leanne to change. As I mentioned, the Law Association, Wellington Law Association, was founded in 1880. It had a number of goals. One was, of course, to do a library, and the stated goal is on the screen, to promote and advance the legal profession by providing resources that support the practice of law. Almost up until earlier in this century, you'll find that it was basically the library was a central part of the involvement of the support of the profession. Lawyers would often go around it in that because that's where you found the law book. We move, click. Okay, in our book, you'll see that there was a declaration done by the number of the members who were part of the law association then. Um, some of the prominent people at the time were Archibald MacDonald, who later became a Crown attorney, Donald Guthrie, Austin Cooper Chadwick, who later became a judge and the first president of the Law Association, Andrew Lemon. He had a daughter, Laura Lemon, who became a prominent musician, and there's a street named after him. Ebenezer Johnson may be the greatest barrister or legal presenter of cases from Guelph. Henry William Peterson was the first Crown attorney, and I'm very pleased that we have in our audience tonight Henry Peterson's great nephew, Larry Peterson from Sault Ste. Marie. We have, you also noticed there was George Drew and a number of other, Kenneth McLean was a longtime lawyer. So they declared, going through the declaration, which is, as I mentioned in our book, and this is the original copy, you'll see that there were a number of goals, primarily the provision of resources for small centers going forward. There were a number, it's supposed to be 5 trustees, and click, can we go to the next page, please? You'll see who the founding members were. You'll see that the first executive had some prominent members. Donald Guthrie, who, as I mentioned, was the great-grandfather of Hugh Guthrie, who practiced in the city for many years, and Mr. Lemon. And those are the founding members. I think there were 18 approximately. That was about half of the number of lawyers in Wellington County. And there's a picture of Judge Chadwick. And there's a picture of him in the Wellington County Museum. Click. Okay. I'm not sure if you ever saw the movie The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Well, the being lawyers, you would have thought that with such prominent people in the prominent lawyers, that when they were incorporating the Wellington Law Association, you would think that they would have incorporated that, taken all the steps necessary. So 93 years after the founding of the Wellington Law Association, Hugh Guthrie, the most recent Hugh Guthrie, got together, and there was a committee of the Wellington Law Association that wanted to formalize, wanted to change the bylaws of the Constitution. So Mr. Guthrie wrote to the Ontario Ministry of Corporate Consumer Affairs, and he asked for a copy of the bylaws and Constitution, and he wrote and he asked, could you send us a copy? What was the answer, Leanne? Could you just find out what the answer was? It looks like in 1880, the Law Association never got around to incorporating itself. So our association in 1973 was told that there was no record of any private bill establishing the Wellington Law Association. So for 93 years, this body conducted meetings, sent members to the judiciary, including Patrick Caron to the chief of the Supreme Court of Canada, and it never existed. So fortunately, this organization got together and formally incorporated itself, and in fact, we established the name from the original was the Wellington Law Association Library to the Wellington Law Association. So I can assure you, having been the president of this body for 4 years, that we check our corporate status every year. We do our filings, and it took us almost 100 years, but we did get our act together. The division in the profession as of 2016, found that in the city of Guelph, there were 117 lawyers in private practice, 64 who were employees. And in the membership of the Wellington Law Association had 151 members. So we had approximately almost 75 to 80% of the actual practicing bar in the city of Guelph County world. So that's a quick picture of where we're at. COVID did affect the way that the Law Association has done its events, just as it has for many other organizations, including the Guelph Historical Society. This was the annual meeting of 2019. We were planning to release this book the following year at the next annual general meeting. Every spring we have an annual before this, we had an annual general meeting, and we have approximately a third of the membership. It's approximately a third of the membership here. We have at the time we had new calls to the bar, and we had Mr. Aldo Breda, who had been practicing since 1955. He's over to the left, just a third front in the second row from the end, just like myself. John Kurt, the Law Association has had a full-time librarian since the 1880s, and this is the most recent picture of the Law Association that we're taking. So that's a bit of a background on how this group started and what it and where it's come to. Our last two annual general meetings have been by Zoom, and we are slowly looking to return, as we are in the courts. Those of us who do litigation have been doing that by Zoom, and we're returning slowly as we are at the Historical Society. So, Leanne, could we go on to the next? I think we're going to the next section.
Yes, thank you, David. And this is my section. So we're going to talk a little bit about the court buildings. And although Wellington County was not formed as a division for court services until 1841, when the District of Wellington was formed, that does not mean that there was not crime nor punishment in the city of Guelph and Wellington County prior to that. In fact, the first crime, if you'd like to call it, occurred in August of 1827, August 12th, during a celebration for the King's birthday, where after imbibing quantities of alcohol, a local pro temp magistrate was cut with a knife and stabbed, and the first crime occurred. Now, for those types of offenses, they would have gone to a higher court. But in the city of Guelph, there were magistrates appointed, and a magistrate really only they were civilian appointments, and they, in many ways, were just to settle disputes. So there were local figures, local leaders, local politicians, and business owners who were appointed as magistrates. And they met from about 1827 on only as needed to settle minor debt disputes and that type of thing. So it really wasn't a court. In 1883, the Court of Requests, the first kind of similar to a divisional court, was held on June 15th, 1833 in the British Coffee House. And the British Coffee House is where the Royal Inn and Suites is now on Carden Street. And then in 1939, we see the building of the county jail, because you have to have somewhere to put all of those offenders. So the county jail, there are remnants of it still left, but you'll see kind of these old fire insurance maps from the 1920s showing the octagonal jail and the jail yard in behind what is now the Wellington County Courthouse, the Wellington Administration Building. Hold on, I just have to admit someone from the waiting room. I'm doing Zoom moderating and speaking at the same time. And there are remnants of the county jail still visible there. In fact, there's the old jail yard in behind the county administration building, which makes a beautiful garden in a pastoral setting, but wasn't always the pastoral park-like setting that you see today. The jail was built in 1839, so it predates the courthouse. In 1841, the court, when the division of the District of Wellington was formed, and court services formally began in the city of Guelph and the county of Wellington, actual court cases needed to be heard and a courthouse was needed. And the plans for building a court were still in their infancy. So from 1841 to 1844, when the county courthouse opened up, a rented room at the Red Lion Inn was used. And that Red Lion Inn later became the Fountain House Hotel. There was a livery stable in behind. And that building is still standing today, but one of the earliest, when you drive by on Gordon Street, you almost can't recognize that it's one of the earliest buildings and the significance in legal history in Guelph. Inside the building are exposed stone walls and hand-hewn beams, so there are little remnants of the age and the distinguished history of this building. Another significant building, 1863, is the County Solicitor's Building at 15 Douglas Street. And here's an older photo of it. It has a long history. Many different offices of county solicitors went through this building. And just listing, I'm not going to list them all, but it's a who's who of legal history in the city of Guelph. Everyone from Bill Peterson, Andrew Lemon to the Guthries, and it is still a Wellington County building today, but it's used for administrative services. So there's a picture of the building today at 15 Douglas Street. During its lifetime, it was the subject of many a demolition discussion. There were opportunities when the building deteriorated to demolish it. There were calls for the wrecking ball, but through the foresight and advocacy in the 1960s and the 1970s, restoration work, new electrical, new plumbing, new roof, gradually were added. And today the building is still serving a very important function in the city of Guelph. So the Wellington County Courthouse, and gosh, now that I know that there's a Wellington County Courthouse book and its writer in the audience tonight, I sure hope I get all of my information right. This is an early drawing by David Allen of, you can see the jail in behind the courthouse, and the very unique style, the dentelated top and parapet of the building is unique. Very regal and legal looking. Its siting on Woolwich Street was the administrative hub of the city, facing the river. So it still plays that prominent role as a streetscape view that it did back then. Built of stone, it was completed in 1844 and has served as a court and still serves court functions today. Although it is the Wellington County Administration Building, it is still serving court functions, trials or adjudicated bodies like the Ontario Land Tribunal, Wellington County Council meetings, lots of official proceedings still happening in this building. It was, again, the subject of potential demolition back in the 1980s. And again, through Wellington County's political leadership, they invested millions in a restoration of this building into a modern added glass additions park under the Carlos Venton was the lead architect on that restoration. And if you've ever been in that building, or if you haven't been in that building, I encourage you to just walk in the front door and see the restoration work. Given the history of this building, it's wonderful that it's had this second life in our city. So we're going to move on to what we have all really come here tonight, which is to talk a little about the scandalous court cases that rocked the city and the county, and where the legal profession rose to the occasion. So David, I'm going to hand it over to you for that first bit of scandal.
Okay, well, Larry Peterson, this involves your family. In the 1870s, the Guelph predecessor, I think it was the predecessor of the Mercury, was riveted for weeks on end with coverage of a essentially, it's not quite a divorce trial, but it was what we would call alimony or spousal support trial that Emma Grange, the wife of the first long-serving Crown attorney, Henry William Peterson, brought a court action. So what essentially happened was Mr. Peterson and Miss Grange married in 1860. Mr. Peterson's father was the first author of a German newspaper in the Kitchener area, which was a large settlement for German-speaking immigrants to Canada, or at that time, Canada West. And Emma Grange, her father was a prominent public official in Guelph. He was the sheriff. And in those days, the sheriff had quite a high profile, as they were one of the top legal government officials enforcing any judgments. In the summer of 1872, the wife of one of the family friends of the Petersons, Mrs. Tuck. So Dr. Herbert Tuck was the doctor for Mr. Grange, the sheriff. Mrs. Tuck went to England for the summer and left behind her husband, Dr. Tuck. There was some hanky-panky going on, whereas Mrs. Peterson.
Alleged, David, alleged. I object. It was alleged.
Well, it was alleged before it went to trial, and then the jury or the judge found against them. But in any event, Mr. Peterson essentially had Mrs. Peterson leave the house because he accused her of adultery. He brought a legal action against Dr. Tuck for adultery in the court at that time was called Berlin, and he won a $5,000 judgment, which when I'm trying to read between the lines here, that would be like in the $500,000 range roughly today. So Dr. Tuck could never pay that. So Mrs. Peterson was asked to leave the house, and in those days, it's Victorian England, it's Victorian Canada. It's not that Mr. Peterson was necessarily a better custodian for their 5 children, but it was the expectation was that the woman would leave, and the mother would leave. So she did, but she wasn't going to take it easy. She had wealth. She had a wealthy family behind her, and she sued Mr. Peterson for what we would call spousal support. But spousal support in those days had a defense. If you could prove that the person seeking it committed adultery, they were out of luck. So Mrs. Peterson's family hired a high-profile lawyer from Toronto, Edward Blake. You may have heard the firm Blake Castles. That's Mr. Blake there. And he was also a leader of the Liberal Party. And Mr. Peterson had on his legal team, besides some local people, Thomas Moss, who would then become a judge of the Court of Appeal, and for a while the head of the Court of Appeal. So Mr. Peterson had to go first. So he brought in some witnesses. First, he brought in a bartender who testified that he saw Dr. Tuck and Mrs. Peterson together in the garden. And he also saw Mrs. Peterson wearing only, the term there is a chemise, which is a night dress, and he found some bottles of wine in her room, because she was staying there. This is at the Crest Hotel, which is in Cambridge at the time. So this is all happening in I believe it was Hespeler then. Another witness was called the bartender. He testified that he had gone up to make a delivery to Mrs. Peterson's room, and he saw her in bed and Dr. Tuck at the foot of the bed. Then Mr. Peterson also called a witness who saw Dr. Tuck in the same room with Mrs. Peterson, and they locked the door, and nobody came out of that room until and she was there until 11 at night. So this happened in the afternoon. He saw Dr. Tuck and Mrs. Peterson go into her hotel room and lock the door, and nobody came out for a long time. And so that was the evidence for Mr. Peterson to defeat the spousal support claim. Well, Mrs. Peterson then tried to contradict that with certain evidence. She tried to call some witnesses to say that what was happening was not didn't occur, and Dr. Tuck was called as a witness to say that they were only friends. They were just spending time together because Mr. Peterson was working in Guelph and he wanted some time to do that. But what killed Mrs. Peterson was on cross-examination. They found a letter that she wrote to Dr. Tuck. And I'm just going to read a couple of parts with it. My dear Dr. Tuck, if you can imagine for a moment I could take your advice and keep quiet, you're mistaken. It's now impossible to continue to live the way things are just now. I had a long talk with Mr. Peterson last night, but they're no better. I think they never will be. We must stick with what we said from the first, but I will not be here much longer. I'm writing in a great hurry for fear someone should see me, so hoping to hear from you. Believe me, hoping to hear from you, Emma Peterson. That seems to have just killed her credibility. The judge hearing the case, who was in the Chancellor of the Exchequer Court at that time, the Court of Chancery, meaning equity, ruled against them. So Mrs. Peterson lost, and that went on for approximately over 2 months in the paper. So Mr. Peterson wanted to get a divorce. So in those days, what you had to do was you had to get a bill from Parliament. So Mr. Peterson went to Ottawa, and from Confederation to 1875, there were only 4 divorce orders granted in Canada. So Mr. Peterson was going to try and be one of the first. So what happened was there was a private member's bill. Then they had a Senate hearing, and there were most of the same witnesses who were called to court came and testified about the situation between Dr. Tuck and Mrs. Peterson, and there was a private member's bill that granted a divorce. So that is probably Guelph's first major family law case. And it looks like it was probably a reflection of the times where matters against, where it was an uphill battle for wives to get anything. So that's one of our primary cases in Guelph. Another one is the Westwood murder. Greg Oakes, one of our members, wrote about Ebenezer Johnson, who, as I mentioned, was probably one of Guelph's primary litigators. He went on to Ottawa. This actually happened in Toronto, but as involved Mr. Peterson, Mr. Johnson, we thought it was important. Frank Westwood was he lived in the Rosedale area of Toronto, and he was going to be inheriting a lot of money. One day he opened his front door and he was shot. Mr. Westwood thought that he saw a male, and he said that was one of his dying declarations. Well, the police did some investigating, and they found that there was a woman named Clara Ford, who was a seamstress who had been rejected many times by Mr. Westwood, and she was coerced into doing a confession and then arrested. So she hired Mr. Johnson as her lawyer. Mr. Johnson attacked the police for coercing the confession from her, and she also had some evidence about some alibi witnesses. The case went to the jury, and she was acquitted. It was a big. There's a book written about it, and it was. It's recalled as one of the leading trials in Toronto in the 19th century. Further than just a couple of quick notes on a couple of other ones, you've seen there's something. The Harvey murders is possibly Guelph's most well-known murder trial. It continues right into this 21st century. There are still people that have events around it. Jay Wilson, who I believe is in our audience tonight, has done the Unfortunate Man tour for a number of years, where he takes people on a tour of all the highlights of where the Harvey murder and evictions and execution took place. And Mary Swan wrote a book in 2008 called Boys in the Trees, and it's based on the the tragedy of the Harvey family. Very quickly, William Harvey was the bookkeeper for William Lyon of the World Publishing Company, which was a large business in Guelph in the 1880s and 1890s. Mr. Harvey was charged with embezzling funds from the company, so he was arrested, but he was out on bail. And then he had a wife, two daughters, and a son. The son was living in Toronto. There was supposed to be some work done on his home, which is right across from the Park Bakery. Right now, it used to be a gas station. Now it's just a big vacant lot. But he sent two workmen home, and he went and got his daughter from school, who was 13, his oldest daughter, and nobody heard from them anymore. And then it turned out Mr. Harvey had killed his wife and two daughters, and then he went over to Hespeler and jumped on the train and was on his way to Toronto. The chief of police from Toronto eventually were from Guelph. They found the bodies. He was arrested, and he went on trial. The trial's known for having been one of the prominent cases as to whether or not he was guilty or not guilty. Although he had 4 psychiatrists, including Dr. Lett from the Homewood, one of the founder psychiatrists at the Homewood, he was convicted and he was hanged. The hanging is known for basically being botched. They hired an amateur person for some money, and it turns out that that person didn't know what they were doing, and Mr. Harvey was left struggling for between 15 and 20 minutes before he died. This was a public spectacle. One of the other major trials in Guelph, the last time that there was a capital punishment was in 1919. And what's remarkable about this is how quickly things started and then got to a conclusion. James Giovinazzi is known as, he's referred to in the judge's report as an Italian. And this is at the end of right after World War I. And basically what happened at 170 Alice Street, which is still standing, there was at the time it was called the House of Prostitution. What Mr. Giovinazzi did was he arranged with another person, the owner of the house. The three of them planned to rob a man, an elderly man who had some money there. They told him that he should go to the house because there were women and liquor there. And so they had him go there. And then when the man was coming out, he had $100 on his person. And we're talking 1919. So the man was robbed, but there was a standby person, Mr. Duchese, who came and tried to intervene. Mr. Giovinazzi is accused of having shot him. And one of the big issues at trial was when the person who was shot before he died, they brought Mr. Giovinazzi and another person in. The other person was with him, and he said that the other person was not the one who shot him, so it must have been Mr. Giovinazzi. Then he died. So that evidence went to the jury, and the judge allowed that in as a dying declaration. So that went to the jury, and he was convicted. The matter went to the Court of Appeal very quickly on that issue, and it was rejected. And Mr. Giovinazzi, as people were allowed to at that time, such as Mr. Harvey, they could request that the death sentence be commuted. It was not allowed to be. It was rejected, and he was hanged. And but just so you know how quickly things go, which is just amazing by today's standards, for any of us who do law. The murder took place on March 30th, 1919. His trial occurred between May 19th and May 21st, 1919. The matter went to the Court of Appeal on June the 19th. The cabinet rejected the petition on April the 15th, and he was hanged on August 22nd. So roughly within 4 to 5 months, you had start to finish. That's just simply unheard of these days. A lot of so Guelph has had a very colorful legal history as far as trials. Leanne, can we do anything on the next? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Leanne about some of the leading people that we have in our who've been members of the Law Association. Yeah, I think you're muted, Leanne.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. Some really intriguing cases, and the Giovinazzi murder, talking about the county jail earlier, was the last execution that happened. Only 6 executions happened in the county jail, and the Giovinazzi was the final execution by hanging. So I'm going to do a really quick bio of some pretty notable historical legal figures in Guelph and Wellington, and we're extremely fortunate to have some real movers and shakers in the legal profession, and other lawyers from Guelph who went on to other fame outside of law during their lives. David Fasken of Fasken was a legal firm out of Elora, practicing in Guelph. And one of the things that David Fasken did is he invested when he was a young man in Texas oil, and moved down to Texas for some time. And it turns out that the oil fields, were not very productive cattle grazing land, and but they contained rich, vast oil reserves. And it is the largest oil fields in Texas, and the Fasken Oil Company today, and the Fasken family today, is the 93rd richest family in America, worth $35 billion because of David Fasken's purchase of land in Texas. George Drew, as many of you know, was the Premier of Ontario, and the Drew family, 3 generations of the Drew family from Elora. The Drew house was located in Elora, and John Jacob Drew, George Drew was his son, went on to become the Premier of Ontario. The Drews are buried, the family is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in a very unique crypt that is very decorative on the north end of Woodlawn, and is often the subject of cemetery talks because of their prominence in Ontario history. I've highlighted Hugh Guthrie here, and I think on the next page I have Donald Guthrie. So, but I'll really quickly, the Guthrie family, 3 generations. Donald, who lived 1840 to 1915, was born in Scotland and was the first of the generation to come, and originally settled in New York, came through New York, and shortly afterwards, in 1854, he moved here from Toronto. He studied law in Toronto with John Helliwell and later Oliver Mowat. Oliver Mowat articled with Sir John A. Macdonald in Kingston. Certainly Donald's career in law was the beginning of a legal dynasty in the city of Guelph. With Hugh C. Guthrie from 1866 to 1839 shown here. He was the eldest son of Donald Guthrie. He was also an excellent cricketer in his youth, and attended Guelph Collegiate Institute, the University of Toronto, and Osgoode Hall. And then he joined in 1888 his father's law firm, Guthrie and Watt, Watt being Frederick Watt. Like his father, Hugh was also interested in politics, and he was first nominated as a candidate in the general election in 1900. So law and politics run deep in the Guthrie family. And then the 3rd generation, of course, is Hugh Guthrie's son, Hugh Guthrie, who was born in 1931 and passed away recently in 2010, and was a great friend to the Guelph Historical Society, and a great friend to the civic life in Guelph as well. Also attended Guelph Collegiate Vocational Institute, University of Toronto and Osgoode Hall. And Hugh Guthrie Park is named after the Guthrie family, father and son. He was Hugh Guthrie Jr. was a county solicitor from 1932 until his retirement. And in 1956, his law firm was known as Hungerford, Gamble and Guthrie until Gamble branched out on his own, and it became Hungerford, Guthrie, Berry, and Hammond. So lots of information about the Guthrie family in the book if you want to read more about this very important legal family. Cyril Launcelot Calthorpe Allinson, CLC Allinson, was another notable historical figure. Now, as a legal figure, he didn't have any famous cases that brought him to national prominence, but he was a significant figure in war history. And we have an entire chapter in the book about Guelph lawyers, Guelph and Wellington lawyers who made a name for themselves in World War I or World War II. And Allinson is known, in fact, he's a curious case that he has an unpublished manuscript that is his World War I diary. And it's Allinson's experience during World War I is the reason why we know that McCrae's composition of In Flanders Fields, the famous World War I poem by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, we know that he wrote it on the back of an ambulance the morning after the death of his very good friend, Alexis Helmer. And the reason we know that is because Cyril Allinson witnessed it. He witnessed it and he walked up to McCrae, who was a friend, asked him what he was doing. McCrae showed him the poem. And Allinson wrote this in his diary. So we have a firsthand primary source account of the inspiration behind the In Flanders Fields poem. I don't know whether his daughter is on our meeting tonight, but his daughter is alive and well and living in the city of Guelph and is in possession of her father's diary. Donald Guthrie, I've talked a little bit about Donald Guthrie and his career. Bill Peterson, I have to say, I'm really honored that Larry Peterson is joining our meeting tonight because Henry William Bill Peterson shouldn't just be remembered for the story that David just recounted about the divorce and the scandal, because Bill Peterson himself was one of the founders of the Art Gallery of Ontario. He had one of the largest homes called Ulmenwald in Guelph, now demolished, on what is now Wolfond Crescent. He had the very first swimming pool or cement pond in Guelph. And he played a prominent role in local politics as well. He was the mayor of Guelph in 1863. He was a school board trustee and a founder of the Wellington County, at that time Wellington School Board. And he wrote their constitution and bylaws, the very first constitution and bylaws of the Wellington County School Board. So he was a county crown attorney, and he practiced with Andrew Lemon. He also was a friend of Hugh Douglas. And when I gave the court building information earlier, I neglected to mention that we've been spelling Douglas Street wrong all these years. The original spelling of Douglas Street, which is actually still visible on some maps, has two S's at the end, because Douglas Street was named after Hugh Douglas, who was a colleague of Mr. Peterson. And Mr. Peterson, I believe, named one of his children Douglas with two S's, and that the spelling of Douglas with two S's, I believe, even comes down to the Peterson family today. It's something we've forgotten in the city of Guelph when we look at Douglas Street, where we've dropped that S for convention, but I believe that the Peterson family still carries on that tradition. Peterson and the family very prominent legal family in Guelph, and should be remembered for more than just the scandal. Joan Heath, David mentioned a little bit earlier, was the first woman to practice law in the city of Guelph. There was previously a woman who was called to the bench and did have a law degree, but she never practiced law. She graduated, but never practiced law. And Joan Heath had a very public service and civic service type of career, forming the legal aid office in Guelph, and working with agencies like what was then the Children's Aid Society, now Guelph and Wellington Family and Children's Services, and was an exceptional lawyer serving the public good. John Kenneth McAllister. I want to tell this story because although he was a lawyer, if you've heard of McAllister Park and McAllister Drive, we have a street and a park named after McAllister, but his story isn't often told. He's a bit of a war hero in that when the war began and Canada entered the war, World War II, he eagerly signed up. He was young. He was just starting out his legal career. And I guess he thought, well, I'll go off to war for a few years and I'll come back and I'll establish my career later. So off he went to Europe and the theater of war, where he began field training. During the training in the field service police, he actually decided he was intrigued and wanted to get involved in espionage and the French Foreign Legion and all of the exciting behind the scenes spy work that was going on. So he joined the Special Operations Executive, and his intent was to encourage sabotage and propaganda. And for us listening here tonight, it's even more meaningful given what's happening with the Ukraine, the kind of risk that he was taking by going undercover and going into the volunteering to do special operations. So he had many different duties with the field secret police and the Special Operations Executive, but his primary goal was to go into occupied territory, and he got his wish, even though he was very junior in the ranks. When he became friends with Captain Frank Pickersgill from Winnipeg. And so they worked together, and they were assigned to work with the local French resistance. Pickersgill was in charge of the network, and McAllister, being a radio operator, would maintain communications with Great Britain. So they were parachuted into the north of France on June 15th, 1943. And although McAllister's French, coming from Guelph, was very limited, and what he learned, his French wasn't that great, they did manage to evade checkpoints, and they did they thought about aborting their mission after they were parachuted in, but they decided to forge ahead. They remained undercover for several days, and then their plan was to take a train to Paris and establish an organization inside France of saboteurs and spies. But later in June, they were stopped by a German checkpoint, and they were with two French nationals who drove away and left the two Canadians to fend for themselves. So they were arrested, and they were moved to a prison near Paris by the Germans, and then later to a camp in Poland. They underwent incredible torture trying to get information, and neither of them balked. Neither of them gave up information. In fact, they continued their espionage and their saboteur ways inside the camp by pretending to have a liaison set up between British forces, and then finding out that that was false. But they tried to always keep the Germans on their toes by setting up false statements and then watching them go on wild duck chases. I don't know if they got enjoyment out of it, but it was very effective in thwarting some of the German activities. Unfortunately, the Germans, they were housed at Gestapo headquarters for a while. And then during the invasion of Normandy, the two men were taken to, along with 37 others, were taken on a train bound for Berlin. But they were actually taken to the concentration camp at Buchenwald. And on August 24th, 1944, the camp was bombed by Allied planes, and McAllister and Pickersgill were kept in a small enclosure surrounded by barbed wire with other Brits and Belgian and Canadian prisoners. And then 16 prisoners in September of 1944 were summoned to the main gate of the camp, where they were taken to special cells and then taken to the crematorium and beaten, and then suspended from wire by meat hooks. And I'm sorry to be graphic, but this is what happened during the war until they strangled, suffocated, and died. There were reports that McAllister, his last words while dying were "Vive le Canada." And so he's certainly become a character, a war hero. CBC documentary has been created about him, and as well as a book about his life and his heroic actions. So those are a few, some of the notable figures that make up our legal profession in Guelph and Wellington. Guelph also boasts several Supreme Court justices. I've just showed 4 here. Patrick Kerwin, one of the finest legal minds in Canada, not just in Guelph, and certainly one of Canada's and Guelph's most famous sons for his role in several important legal cases in Canadian history. John Iddington of Centre Wellington, Lyman Poor Duff, another Supreme Court justice, and Frank Joseph Hughes. And I would go on about all of their cases, but I want you to read the book about their and about the life. And I know we're starting to run out of time, so we can't go into a biography of each one. But suffice to say that each of these men made a name for themselves, brought glory to Guelph and Wellington, and are in the history books of the Canadian legal profession for their fine legal minds. We're going to talk just briefly about the Law Association Book Project. David gave a great introduction of how it all came to be at the beginning of the meeting. The first person to start assembling the stories of the Wellington Law Association was Cyril Allinson himself. In the 1950s, he started the very first book project by collecting as much information from the archives of the Wellington Law Association, and really was the precursor of the book that we have today. David, do you want to talk a little bit about Blaine Baker and the rest of the book committee?
Oh, sure. Yes, very quickly. Professor Blaine Baker was a legal historian from McGill University. He was, we had a summer student in 2010, Arnhem Quadri, who had studied with him and put us in touch with him. And Professor Baker was quite happy to sort of give us some guidance. The one thing that we wanted to make sure was that was that local members could contribute, and we had of our, I think it's 16 chapters, approximately 12 were from members or local authors. Unfortunately, so we were moving along quite well. We had all the background done. Unfortunately, Professor Baker passed away in 2018. There were 3 of us that had been working with him from approximately 2010. Myself, Carol Vandenhoek, who was the president of the Wellington Law Association at the time, and Lois Payne, who was the city solicitor for the city of Guelph, and continued after her retirement. So in the summer of 2018, we were looking at a launch in approximately 2019, and I happened to be fortunate being on the Guelph Historical Society to have met Leanne. And I remembered that in approximately 2010, 2011, she had been the the creative force behind the book on the Guelph police. So I approached Leanne about, could you help us go through? Professor Baker was still around, like we were. So the two of them liaised, and fortunately, all the materials were drawn together before Professor Baker passed away he was very young at age 65 in July of 2018. So what we did was basically we put all the finishing touches on the book, and we were planning to launch it in 2020, and we were 2 months away from that, and then COVID came. So we did a number of things, and it came out toward the end of last year. We haven't done anything major with it. We're going to have some sort of modest book launch, and the book is Guelph and Wellington County's legal history. Thank you, Leanne. And it's available on the Wellington Law Association website, or you can see Leanne or myself anytime. And Leanne, we also had help from other members of the Guelph Historical Society, Anne Guthrie, who is Hugh Guthrie's daughter, and she's been around. Your family's been around as long as the Wellington Law Association.
And she's a wizard with a red pen. She has an editor's eagle eye like no one I have ever met in my life.
Right, and I think Anne is listening tonight.
Is she?
And Amy McBride Bowen, who I'm not sure she's here. She was a graduate. She was a University of Guelph history major, and she joined us. She joined the association and helped as well. So there's a number of people involved. Mr. Baker, Professor Baker, Lois, Carol, Leanne, Anne, Amy, all contributed, and this book could not have come out without such a team behind it. Leanne, on your end, anything you'd like us to tell? Anything you could tell, because you sort of came in toward the end. But did you find anything in the experience?
Oh, it was a privilege to be involved with this group. The stories of legal history in the city of Guelph, I did not realize were so compelling and of such national significance. So I just feel really privileged to have been involved, David.
Are there any questions? You can either you can put them on the chat, you can direct them to us, whatever works. And it's however long you want to take it, or we're not hoping to keep all year. I did notice that Her Honor Justice Caspers and Alec and her husband Alex Smith, who was a former prosecutor, made an interesting comment that it appears that Wellington County is always looking for a new courthouse to improve. For as long as I've been on the Law Association, which from 2008 on, we've always been looking to have a newer facility, and we were really close in, as I recall, around 2008, 2009. And then it went to St. Thomas. So somehow we lost out, and I'm not sure where I'm not sure where we rank right now, but it'll probably continue to be a goal for the Law Association. Probably a bit of a challenge because Milton was supposed to have a new courthouse, and that was scuttled. So probably behind them, but hope springs eternal.
And I think what's interesting, not a question, but now that this book is complete and the history of the Wellington Law Association, and the book goes right up to the present, it goes right up to 2020, including any legal figures that passed away in the last 10 years. So the challenge now is to keep that history going, because there's still lots more history to tell.
I see there's a question from Alicia De Laurentiis, who was a contributing author. What is the most memorable or surprising feedback you've received on the book? For me personally, I mean, outside of people such as, outside of the experience of working with people such as Patrick McKenna, who is the grandson of Patrick Kerwin, or through my association with Larry Peterson, for me, it was a chapter on the war. People like, like John Kenneth McAllister. There was also people. If you go through the chapter, there were many people who gave major contributions. And aside from Patrick McKenna, there was a young man from Arthur, Stanley Brocklebank, who was wounded a number of times. He died just days short of the end of World War II or World War I. The other thing that really stood out to me was the contribution of Inga Rinne on the challenges of being a young woman practicing in the legal profession. She's with that wave with Justice Kaspers and a few others that made the legal profession more diverse in the county. And to hear some of the stories that they told, was really makes you realize, that it was not an easy haul back in as recently as the 1980s to be a woman and to trying to practice law. So the war stories, being with people, associated with it, and the story of the women who have made the association so much richer for their involvement were what's important, or is what struck me.
Yeah, for me, actually, the story of Inga Rinne was a good one for me as well. I did not realize that the Law Association had no benefits for maternity. And this is in the 1980s, 1990s. And that when she went on maternity leave, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, she was in the middle of a trial and there was no one to take over for her. So she wrote in the chapter that she contributed to the book about bringing her 1-month-old baby, complete with all the baby stuff, to a trial, so that she could represent her clients. So that kind of dedication really inspired me. But for me, the most memorable story was that of CLC Allenson, Cyril Allenson, because I didn't realize that the significance of his connection with Lieutenant Colonel McCrae and the historical record of the writing of In Flanders Fields. And then the reason why it was memorable as well is because I lived for 26 years on Mary Street, and his daughter was my next door neighbor. And I did not realize that was her father. She's certainly very proud of his contribution to Canadian history. And so I thought it was a great local story. So that was memorable. And the memories keep being made. Like I said, I'm really thrilled to see Larry Peterson on this call, because when I was doing an article on Ilmenwald, I made contact with the Peterson family in Toronto and went down to visit and got to see, at that time they had the family portraits of Bill Peterson that I hadn't seen before, and photos of their old house Ilmenwald which was once on McCrae Boulevard, right around the block from where I lived for 26 years. And I knew of the Peterson family because the house I lived in, there was an elderly woman. She was living in Stone Lodge at the time, Naomi Jotham, and she told me the story of the Peterson home in the woods, and that the woods were covered in violets in the spring. And in the 1930s, when she was a little girl, she was caught by Mrs. Peterson, second generation Mrs. Peterson. The wife of Clayton Peterson. She was caught picking violets and chased out of the woods. And she remembered that. And she was 93, 94 years old in Stone Lodge when I went to interview her. And she had that childhood memory of the Peterson property and picking violets as a child. And I thought that must have been a really embedded moment in her life, where she was caught trespassing in the woods.
I noticed
It's the little side stories that are memorable for me. It wasn't all the chapters and all of the notable figures. It was all the little side stories that that made a difference for how I experienced this book.
I see Alex Smith, you had your hand. Did you want to contribute anything,
Yeah,
Alex?
yeah. Give the just unmute yourself and go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say wonderful presentation, really enjoyed it, and a wonderful book. Guelph's been blessed by a wonderful bar and a wonderful judiciary, chock-a-block full of characters and really fine advocates. And I think it's really valuable that you guys have taken the time to write it down so that it will be preserved for the future. I don't know if Jane has anything to add.
No, I do not, except that I see my former colleague Kaz Harold on this, and I say hello to him, and it was always wonderful working with him. So to all of you, I think you've just done an amazing job.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I can tell you that if you want to hear about stories, I can tell you that number of times I would be in the same courtroom as Justice Harold and Justice Caspers the same week there. Sometimes you have to make sure that you were on your toes. Maybe we should do a story about that for our next book. Are there any other comments? Does anyone else want to add anything? Any other comments or? Okay. All right. Kevin Puddester, are you on? Can you add any? Okay.
Well, I just, on behalf of the Historical Society, David and Leanne, this is a great presentation. David, you and your team that put this book together, I think you should be very proud. It sounds like a really great piece for the historical record, and something I guess I'm going to have to pick up a copy when we meet in person again sometime. A lot of interesting things in there. And I live just around the corner from McAllister Boulevard, and I was fascinated with that story. I'm going to have to learn a little bit about that myself. So thank you for that. I guess folks have had an opportunity to ask questions. I'll just, I guess we'll just wrap up here. Susan Ratcliffe says, if you want to know the history of Guelph's prison history, I did a talk for the library and would be happy to share it with the GHS. Well, perhaps that's something that we can connect our membership to through the email or at a future lecture. Speaking of which, we're going to, David said we don't normally do a May meeting. We're going to be adjourning for the summer from our lecture series and coming back together, I believe, in October. So keep an eye out in your email for news about that as it becomes available. And that will also be a combination meeting. It'll also be our AGM, which we've put off because of pandemic and other delays. So thank you for bearing with us on that. David, are there any other announcements I am missing?
No, I think we're good. We're looking forward to either coming back in person or perhaps doing something hybrid, some Zoom, some in person in the new year. And for anyone who's not a member of the Guelph Historical Society, if you're interested, we'd love to have members all the time. And I've been on this, I've been president for 10 years, if you can believe it. It's like a Senate appointment. And I'm looking forward to many more years on it.
That's great. He's on the record. Thank you very much, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you all in person sometime.
Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great spring and summer.